Hello and welcome to, it is March, isn't it? Yes, March is all the everything. Thank you so much for joining me. This is one of those topics I can't quite believe I have never recorded a show on before. It's like, I mean, I certainly would have mentioned this collection of topics, kind of soul work and archetypes separately, tons. And it definitely would have woven into numerous shows and all sorts of things that we've done. But I've never done a show that is literally focused on how archetypes can help us do our soul work ever, and certainly not to like this extent where it's like a whole 45 minutes or whatever it's going to be dedicated purely to it. So I am very excited. And even more so, just finished in the pre-show party in our Facebook group and hearing some of the experiences of people who have journeyed with us in crucibles like Wake and Wild Medicine, where they've really felt this sense of like coming home to their archetype and have experienced exactly what we're going to be talking about today, how that's helped them to do their soul work. It's just like, as I was saying, it's like for me, beyond anything I can really express in words what that really means to me. It really is literally why I do what I do. So I'm feeling already like my heart is just bursting with joy on this topic and already hearing what this has meant for other people. Okay, let's begin. And I would also say, whilst this isn't going to be one of the episodes where it's like particularly interactive, where I'm going to be asking lots of questions, there's probably going to be quite a lot in it that's going to be let's say activating and illuminating. And so you might want to go grab a pen and paper, and so you can capture things as they arise. I'd be surprised if that doesn't happen. So that might be wise to grab if you haven't already got. I'm going to start with a quote that I came across years ago, and then I happened to just see it again the last day or so, and it captures so beautifully one of the reasons I love working with archetypes so much. And it's by Caroline Miss rather. If you know your archetypes and not just yours, if you know how to perceive the world in archetypes, through archetypes, everything changes. Everything. Because you have two things. You can see through one eye, which is impersonal, and through the other, which is personal. That's the way the game is written down here. That's just giving me chills, actually, just reading that out loud. And I love the fact that she actually says everything. Everything changes everything. And that's been my experience too. It really isn't overstating the power of archetypes to say that. That's been my experience. And that last line, that's the way the game is written down here. That evokes beautifully one of the reasons archetypes are so perfect and so powerful and so opening for us is they are this incredibly precise lens for seeing that that's what life is, this constant dance between the personal and impersonal that as humans, particularly modern humans, we really struggle to recognize. We're usually so deep in the personal, we really miss the impersonal. And also again, that dance, that connection between the two of them. Which brings me to another quote that I quote constantly, and it's by Carl Rogers, who's a Jungian psychotherapist. And the quote is, "What is most personal is most universal." And the reason, again, this is so helpful is the more we are recognizing that's at play all the time, the more open we are to things beyond that just limited view that we have of ourselves, what we've seen around us, particularly when we were younger via our kind of primary caregivers. And then as we grow up, kind of like all the conditioning and wounding that's said, like, this is me, this is what's possible for me, and that's all there is. And the more we can see what is true for us is also true for the collective, but also vice versa. The more we get these openings into what reality really is and what's really possible for us. So big start. And so I want to come to my intention for today's episode. And it isn't only to open the door to the very real power and wonder of archetypes, and particularly in the way that I experience them. But it's actually more than that. It's to invite you to see how they could help you in discovering and doing your soul work in like just an incredibly tangible, practical way. Whilst, you know, hey, the archetypes are incredibly like divine and magical and mythical and all the things that I absolutely love, they are also so materially practical too, which kind of for me is really like, that's how we create beauty on earth. It's that bringing those two things together. And maybe that being able to create beauty here on earth maybe is the whole point. So I'm going to start with a definition. I don't always do this, but I often quite like to start with the dictionary definition of one of the things that I'm talking about. And for this one, it's archetype. So if we look up the dictionary definition, this is one kind of picked at random. They all say similar things. The original pattern or model from which all things of the same kind are copied or on which they are based, a model or first form, prototype. And then there's a follow-up bullet. In Jungian psychology, a collectively inherited unconscious idea, pattern of thought, image, etc., universally present in individual psyches. And the way that I'll be speaking about them, as you'll know, if you've followed me at all for any amount of time, you'll know that I'm very, very influenced by Jung. And I'm really speaking about it. When I talk about archetypes, really is kind of like both ways of, to me, they overlap. They're the same thing. I guess the way that Jung introduces to the archetype, or let's say reintroduced very ancient wisdom, is a deeper understanding of that kind of more basic understanding of archetypes. So in short, archetypes are patterns. You probably heard the word pattern was used numerous times in that definition. And it's very specifically, they're original patterns. They are the kind of like the earliest or first form of these patterns. And they are held outside of the personal. It's not to say that we can't have our own personal understanding them, but they're very much held in the collective at a conscious and unconscious level. So some of this will be conscious too, and there's much that's going on behind the scenes that's in the unconscious. And these archetypal patterns, like, again, typically when we think of archetypes, we might think of archetypes like the Queen, the Magician, my mind's gone blank, the Warrior. I thought my mind would go blank when I'm naming different archetypes, which I do all day long. So anyway, we might think of archetypes only being those kind of almost like people, but archetypes and archetypal patterns can be all kinds of things. They don't have to be something that we could see as a single person. One of the archetypes I speak about a lot is that of the village. And by village, I mean the true village, the kind of community that humans really lived in, were part of for much of our time on this planet. That's an archetype. One, unfortunately, right now, we're fairly bereft of in this modern world. And one way or another, I do really believe we are in the work of reanimating that. But that's an example of an archetype that's not the kind we're going to be focusing on, but I think it's important to recognize, like when we're talking about archetypes, they can come in many forms. So again, right now, we're going to be focusing on those patterns that create different kinds of individual human experience. And the reason I'm making a big deal of this word pattern is not just because I'm autistic and I love patterns. It's because that word pattern does allow us, I think, to see more clearly that these archetypes are impersonal and original. They exist beyond and before each of us as individual humans, even though, again, we are going to have very personal relationships to them. They exist beyond and before the human. So, oh, and that kind of begs the question, actually, when we say patterns, patterns of what are those patterns made of? They're not kind of knitting patterns. So what are they? And as part of me, it's a little bit like, oh, this is kind of one of those words that's got a lot of baggage and has been overused, but it's best I've got. I would say they're energetic patterns. They're patterns of energy. And they are patterns in the way, for example, we might describe a blueprint or an architectural design. And from that pattern, we can then build many things of that kind from. So if we had an archetypes plan, we could then build hundreds, thousands of houses from that original plan. Each of the, or design, whatever they're called. Funny enough, I've been talking to someone about a plan that we're in the middle of about to start building here. But from that plan, we could then build lots and lots of houses, but each also would be individual, unique. We can't build the exact same thing twice, certainly here, you know, in this planet, in any way, shape or form that is natural. So recognize too that the archetypes themselves are these blueprints, and then they become created in a new way, unique way, when they're embodied in humans as individuals. Okay, right. So when we speak of working with archetypes, what I mean really is, firstly, making conscious the ones that are soul aligned for us individually. There's some archetypes which almost all of us, it's going to be aligned for us to embody. And there's some that are very specifically for us and others that aren't. And I'll be naming some examples of that as I go, and I'll be talking about some of mine personally. But this is really helpful to recognize there are some that are meant for you. You may not know it yet, but your soul does. Your soul chose that before you came here, and it's held there. It's not going anywhere. The archetype is held there until you're ready to work with it. And so again, when I'm talking about working with archetypes, I very specifically mean the ones that are right for you, not just any random ones because it feels like a good idea. I also mean embodying and expressing those archetypes that are right for you in a way that's uniquely right for you. Recognizing, again, just like I described about the house, even a house, which are fairly, you know, particularly if you're building new houses, they, you know, fairly similar, still, there are each of them will be individual. When it comes to humans embodying and expressing archetypes, the differences will be even greater because they are being filtered through your soul into your life, into the context of your life. So there'll be something very individual about your embodiment expression of them. And this is where it comes to the relevance to soul work. When it comes to the magical service orientated archetypes, and I'm going to give some examples of that in a moment. When you embody and express those archetypes in the way that is uniquely right for you, you can't help but do your soul work. You can't help but fulfill your purpose. It just comes with the territory. It is inevitable. So when I say, and I will certainly say more about this in a moment, but when I say the magical service orientated archetypes, I mean archetypes like the shaman, the priest, the priestess, the sage, the oracle, the seer. These archetypes are inherently magical, as in they work with elements of the magic, or what you could call spirit, and they are specifically designed to serve the collective, to serve on behalf of spirit. That's the point of them. They almost don't really exist without that. So that's what we're going to be really focusing in on in this episode. Are there archetypes that are service orientated that aren't magical? Of course there are. I'm trying to think of an example now that isn't going to encroach on magical territory. I mean, this is a little bit smaller than I mean, but we could say, for example, a baker. It's a little bit of a diluted archetype, but for the moment that will do. A baker is to an extent an archetype. It is service orientated, and yet it's not magical. So as we move into this conversation more and more now, we're talking about the magical archetypes, and we're specifically talking about the ones who are service orientated. There are magical archetypes that aren't service orientated in the way that I'm describing. So you could say the magician isn't inherently service orientated. It can be expressed in that way, but it's not inherently that way. Same, for example, like the sorcerer. The witch is an interesting one. So the witch, there very much can be a service orientation, but not always. So just recognize we are now talking specifically about those archetypes. And when I say, for example, the shaman, and I'm going to share more about this for me personally a bit later in the show, just because we're called to embody a particular archetype, it doesn't mean that we then have to like do that as a job in its entirety or call ourselves that. Again, in my example, and I'll share more in a bit, although my devotion and my work is shamanism, although the shaman is one of my primary archetypes, I don't call myself a shaman. Much of the work I do certainly kind of like has a sort of shamanic infusion, but isn't necessarily kind of like pure what you might describe like shamanic work. And this is again about the archetype rather than the different individual expressions of the archetype. So really important knowing that. If you're hearing like, well, I don't think I'm here to be a priest or a priestess, recognize we're talking about the archetypal qualities of that, then expressed through you, not you just kind of like adopting lock, stock, and barrel, this idea of like, well, therefore I need to be a priest. Okay, we take a sip of my lemon and ginger tea, and then we'll move on. So I've heard recently some interesting conversations going on online where people are, you know, I think archetypes is wonderfully an idea whose time has come, but of course it's not just come now, it's come again and again and again through human history, but it certainly feels like there's a kind of resurgence of interest at the moment. And then I've noticed a lot of like misunderstanding maybe about what archetypes mean, and very much can seem as though they're just kind of like ego inflation, role play, fantasy, almost like a bypassing being human, and as if there's something that we can kind of opt out of. Like, I'm not interested in archetypes, therefore, like, I'm just going to leave that to the people that just think they're a good idea, and I'm going to opt out of them. The truth is, like it or not, we are all living out these archetypes, mostly unconsciously. In fact, probably the vast majority of the time unconsciously, but we still are. There isn't a way that we can opt out of that. Archetypes play a significant role in our human lives. And so all of us will already be embodying some of them to, again, varying degrees of consciousness, and also from varying degrees of wounding. So some of the ones that you will, if you're listening, will have been embodying, have been embodying, are working to embody, are archetypes like mother, father, son, daughter, lover, leader. These are archetypes that, again, to some extent, not as in all of them clearly, but some of those are ones that you likely will have been embodying to varying degrees of consciousness and from varying degrees of wounding. This is true for all of us. And this is why it's so important. This goes back to another one of those quotes that I constantly quote, and of course it is by Jung. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And why this is particularly important when it comes to the archetypes is, as I've just said, we will all be playing out these archetypes largely unconsciously. We will then live out a life where we don't know why we're, for example, in these like wounded dynamics with lovers, with our parents, with our children, with whoever, because it's all going to be coming, or most of it's going to be coming from an unconscious place. When it comes to these magical archetypes, that's even more the case, because these are not archetypes that we have there visible in our culture outside of, you know, fantasy novels and outside of films and things of that nature. Game of Thrones, just to be clear, not knocking that, I love all of that. But for most of us in this modern world, that's where we will have had any awareness of these kind of archetypes. And most of us will not have had the consciousness that they are possible for humans to embody, let alone ourselves. So this is where this particular quote of making the unconscious conscious, or it will direct your life and you'll call it fate, becomes really, really important. And I could give you, I'm sorry, I'm just going to ask my family to deal with the dogs and shut the door. This is where I could give you so many examples of people that we've worked with who have recovered from, you know, many, many, many years of health conditions, many years of, I don't know, struggling to do work that really feels fulfilling, like they're really meant to do it. And I mean, I could literally give you numerous examples, and so much of it comes down to them unconsciously playing out aspects of archetypes that are meant for them, but because they're not aware of it and because they have so much wounding, they are being expressed in ways that are not how they actually are here to live. They would look back on their life and say, well, it was fate that this happened. And I've got very personal experiences of that myself, which again, for many years, I didn't know any of what I'm talking about here was a thing. I had no idea that my decades of really difficult experiences, both in terms of and you almost certainly would have heard me talk about these things before if you've listened to any of my previous podcasts. I have had a lifetime of all sorts of very strange things happening from a you could say psychological level. That's what I thought it was. It wasn't really. Hallucination, scintillating stoma, all sorts of strange things, and also had 15 years of chronic facial pain. So I've experienced what life is like whilst I was unconsciously playing out, or not even aware of where I could play out and embody and express archetypes that were meant for me, and particularly, again, the magical ones. Okay, so the work for all of us who are called to individuation, who are called to actualize whatever we came here for as a soul, the work for that is to recognize what it is that our soul has called us here for, and then be in that work of embodying and expressing them. And there is another gorgeous quote I'm going to share with you that particularly talks to the importance of these magical archetypes. And it's by someone called Margot, might be Margot Adler. The gods and goddesses of myth, legend, and fairy tale represent archetypes, real potencies and potentialities deep within the psyche, which, when allowed to flower, permit us to be more fully human. I love that so much. Part of the reason I love it is one of the real misunderstandings of, and I was touching on this earlier when I was saying I've seen a lot lately about kind of misunderstandings of archetypes. There can be this sense they're like fantasy or bypassing, when the truth is, when we engage with the archetypes, when we embody and express the archetypes in the way that really, again, is our birthright, they actually allow us to be more human, to be in the world more fully, to be more whole. these aren't just, again, like, oh, nice ideas. I could sort of float around in a beautiful dress and kind of, wave my handkerchief out the window and, not knocking any of that. I love beautiful dresses. And I've got nothing against waving handkerchiefs out of windows. And there is so much more possible for us that, again, is very, very much about us being able to be fully human in the way that's uniquely right for us. Okay. So going back to why in particular the magical archetypes and having a conscious relationship to the archetypes themselves is, I think, essential. These archetypes, the magical archetypes, are rare in our modern culture. Even if we believe it is possible to be things like a priest or priestess, probably we won't have a sense of some of the others like the seer or the oracle. But even if we believe they kind of like possibly could exist for someone somewhere, chances are we won't know anyone. We won't literally have experienced someone embodying that archetype in our life. And it becomes this really, huge challenge when we've got nothing to see to model from. Humans very much are meant to see something and know it's possible for us, to have that activation of what's possible for us. And so without that conscious modeling and guidance of, firstly, someone who does have some understanding and embodiment of that archetype, without that, but also very specifically from the archetype itself, it will be, if not impossible, certainly extremely challenging. And so again, I'm going to really emphasize why this is the case, because it can sound as though like, well, why can't I just, be who I came here to be without that? And so again, very specifically, we don't have a map for it. We don't have a blueprint for it. We don't have a model for it in our modern culture. We're going to be really limited by what we've seen around us as we've grown up. We will be limited by what we've been told and what we've seen. If we then start to have this sense of like, oh, I don't think I'm here just to be a, website designer. And I say just, I used to be a website designer, so I don't mean that in a derogatory fashion to website designers. I'm not that, but that's not what I'm here to do. I'm here to do something, I don't know, maybe more spiritual. In order to do that, it was going to require us being very different to those around us. That on its own is really scary for most of us. We really don't like having that sense of difference to people around us. So that will be really scary. Thirdly, this is something I've seen now so deeply year after year, particularly in the work we do in Wake Wild Medicine, how essential this is. It's going to require us entering our deepest, most painful, often shameful wounds in order to heal and alchemize them into our gifts. This is true for all gifts. This is true for all wounds. But again, even more the case, if it's possible to say even more the case with something that's already true when it comes to our magical gifts. So this is why having that guidance, that role modeling, that North Star of the archetypes is so essential in order to be able to journey through that limitation of like, well, I can't even see anything out there remotely like it. In order to journey through that, like, oh, I'm going to have to be different to everyone around me. In order to like sustain ourselves through the deepest, most painful work in our life of entering our wounds, we are going to need those archetypes to support us, to guide us, and to empower us. Okay, I'm just going to take another sip of my tea and then I'm going to touch on a particular example, and then I'm going to share a little bit about my own story. So one of the places we've seen over the years this show up over and over and over again is with change workers in particular. And I think let's just, for ease as, say, coaches. They may not describe themselves as coaches, and certainly what I'm about to say often applies to, say, for example, therapists as well. You know, they might call themselves all kinds of things, spiritual teachers, but I'm just going to use the word coaches for the moment. And that it is coaches in particular that I've seen what I'm about to describe show up as in those three different things I've just been talking about. I'm going to give you now an example of how this shows up for coaches in particular. So most people who are coaches didn't kind of like finish school, university, whatever, and then just dive straight into the world and be a coach. The vast majority of coaches came from some other kind of career, often will have had either some kind of like life-changing experience, or perhaps worked with a coach and kind of was like, wow, this is incredible, this is what's possible. Maybe a mixture of both, and then realize like, oh my gosh, this feels so much more me than whatever it is that I'm already doing. And so they've already made this big shift out of what's normal. Certainly what's normal for them. And, you know, certainly going back, you know, at this point, and certainly in the world that I'm in, you know, every other person is a coach, but, you know, like when we're not in that world, it already can feel quite a stretch. But at least if you're a coach, when we apply that first kind of like question of like, when we look around us, do we see any example of what it is we're being called for? If you're a coach, yes, you can look around and go, yep, there are other coaches in the world. But if you are actually being called to one of the magical archetypes, let's say the shaman, you likely won't see many other shamans. And the shaman's possibly one of the ones we do see the most of, but I'm going to use that as the example. Certainly when I was going through this journey myself, which I'll share more about in a moment, it wasn't like I was kind of in this community of coaches, but then I was also seeing, there's also these shamans. At that point, they just weren't visible to me. So that creates this sense of like, okay, that's what exists in the world. In order for me to like do what I feel like I've come here to do, to serve others, the way I need to do that is to be a coach. And then if they start to get a sense of like, but I feel like I'm being called to something else, something that perhaps isn't just based in this material world, it's going to require doing and talking about things that other people, and especially potentially other coaches, will judge. Certainly, again, for me personally, but also many of the coaches we've worked with are making this transition into doing their soul work. They have this sense of like, oh my gosh, what are people going to think if I start talking about magic or spirit or whatever the thing is? Both, again, their community around them, that might be other coaches, but also their family. There's going to be this sense of like, oh, you know, like I've just got everyone on board of the fact that I'm a coach, and now I've got to be talking about like, I don't know, like, yeah, spirituality, or making offerings, or, you know, going and spending time with my tree, whatever the thing is. So that's going to be really challenging. And then again, coming back to the wounds, in order to even kind of like be out in the world as a coach, you would have had to probably overcome some of the stuff that was in the way of you being able to kind of, you know, show up in the world, you know, whether that's on social media, whether that's with your clients. You definitely would have had to move through some of that. But there will absolutely be others that are required for you to really enter and heal, to be fully in this like full expression of yourself. And particularly again, when you've already got this sense of like, God, I've just completely changed my life, moved away from my career, I'm now a coach, like why on earth would I go into my wounds and like disrupt everything to start all over again in this other way without that magical archetype as the North Star? That would be, again, I'm not going to say impossible, but very, very challenging. Okay, I am now going to give you a potted history of, and I'm going to have to leave so much out because I mean it really is it's a journey of a lifetime, but it's certainly particularly my journey over the last 11 years. And I'm going to speak about it very specifically through this lens of the archetypes. So 11 years ago, I was working as a leader in a multinational corporate and had really turned my back on a very kind of wild and magical childhood. I'd really pushed that away for all kinds of reasons. I'm not going to go into too much right now. I've spoken about lots of these things before, but right now I'm going to focus on that's where I was 11 years ago. My father died unexpectedly, and it created this kind of just absolute blasting open to, I guess, all that is, to the universe, to spirit. And I then consciously, I had this kind of very spontaneous opening, and then consciously devoted myself to various forms of non-dual spirituality. And so actually trained as a teacher in a particular form. So then I always had this sense of I don't really know what to call myself. And so often I'd call myself a coach, although it didn't quite feel that it really, always felt like this kind of quite ugly coat that I was wearing that kind of did the job, but didn't ever feel that it was me. But it was the best I'd got. And where possible, I just avoid calling myself anything. And I look back now and I see I was actually unconsciously embodying the priestess. So was I embodying the priestess? And if you've heard me speak about the priestess is very much here to serve her community, serve, the collective, and particularly has a very strong, deep connection to the divine, and will often work in ways where she's allowing others to open to the divine in whatever's right for them. This is very much the role of the priestess. And that was very much what I was doing. I was, one way or another, bringing people closer to spirit. And so I was embodying the priestess, but I certainly wasn't, the word priestess was nowhere in my mind whatsoever. And so there was only a kind of, let's say, I could only embody a quite small percentage of what's really possible with the priestess, who is, an incredibly powerful, huge archetype. And then at that point, again, I just didn't really have as much as I knew what archetypes were. And I'd actually had a childhood that without me really realizing was immersed in archetypes. I was obsessed with myths and legends. We play Dungeons and Dragons, which kind of has all of the gorgeous archetypes, including the magical ones. So it really was one of those childhoods that, one way or another, it was very alive with archetypes, but it wasn't something I'd really thought anything about in adult life particularly. And then 6 years ago, seemingly out of nowhere, and I really honestly cannot tell you where this came from, because it really was out of nowhere, seemingly, as far as I can remember. I had this awareness of what I was calling then the wild priestess. And I had, I need to take a moment because it's, I've managed to I've done well to get this far without tears on this topic. When I look back, I had no understanding at the time of what she would come to mean to me and what she would provide to me. But back then, I just had this sense of both the priestess aspects of her, and I was running circles for women, and I could sort of see there was something around that role, of holding space and kind of, again, bringing people into a more conscious relationship with spirit. I could see aspects of that in the priestess, and also this call back to the wild. My childhood, as I say, was very, very wild. We literally, at points were living outside under the stars. So it was a real call back to that very deep connection I'd always had, but had pushed away. And so came like in this kind of twofold sense of this is what's meant for me. And I devoted a year to journeying as deeply and consciously with this archetype, without any sense of, like, it wasn't like I was looking to other humans as role models. I didn't have one. I was literally opening to the archetype herself, to the wild priestess, and letting her show me what was next, what was next, what was next. And she led me, and this is again the incredible power and beauty of the archetypes. She called me to, again, that what we might call rewilding, nature connection, which, as you'll know now, is, you know, one of the most important parts of the work we do. That wasn't the case before then. The work we was doing was, you know, very, very non-dual spirituality. We weren't talking constantly, like, it started to creep into our work, partly just because of who Jonathan and I are and because of our connection to the wild, but it really wasn't consciously in our work until, for both of us, we were kind of, I guess, reclaiming this in different ways. But this for me was very much what the wild priestess was calling me to. She also called me to the work of feminine reclamation and the healing work that was necessary, both in terms of my relationship to the feminine, but also my relationship to the masculine, and ultimately to union, which is my deepest devotion. And I wasn't aware of that at all. That was something that was so deep in my subconscious. I was not aware that that was what I was here for. So she led me there. She also opened me up to the other archetypes, and specifically the way that I'm here to work with other people in that way. Like, I struggle to use this word because I think it's been so overused, misused, and has so much baggage attached. But in short, that I'm here to channel the archetypes in a way that allows others to feel the activation of those that are meant for them. So not all of the archetypes I speak about are ones that I'm here to embody in a kind of very pronounced sense. I have aspects of them, I can feel their energy, but most of the time when I'm talking about the archetypes that aren't actually mine, it's because they're coming through me for other people. And it was her that showed me that. She also called me into magic, and specifically into shamanism. And that was probably one of the hardest parts of my journey. You probably heard me say before, I did come from a very magical childhood. It wasn't that my childhood, like, thankfully, compared to most children, my childhood was actually still filled with magic, as it would be in our kind of the life way that would be natural to humans. But she really needed to call me back there for that to be something that felt at all safe and to put at all right. So over the last, it's really hard to kind of give definite timescales, because in many ways that call back to nature was really a call to shamanism, although I wasn't consciously aware of it until 3 years ago, when it was very clear I had to do that in a much more conscious and committed way. So they are all, and I could name others, but they are the really like so important to me, so aligned for me, paths that the wild priestess has called me to, and again, and other archetypes too. And so I'm now at a stage where I'm completing on, this year I'll be completing on that conscious commitment to shamanism. And I don't mean as in therefore it's done, but a particular cycle of work around that. I'm now being called very much again, and particularly in the last couple of months, the priestess has been so alive in my awareness again. For a while she'd been quieter, and I think really so I could be fully embodying the shaman archetype and really allow myself to to know that archetype and what that archetype meant for me more deeply first. Now she's back and showing me what's next. Some of those things I'm still not fully aware of. This really is, I'm speaking right now, right in the middle of this transition where I'm kind of really recognizing, okay, there's more for me to do with the priestess. What I do know of is it's very much a call into what you could say is like the all mother or the great mother, a much more conscious relationship with the child. And when I say the child, that includes my child, but it also means children, and it means the child of all the people that we work with. She very much has this deeply, deeply important role in community, which has always been something that's been important to me and very important to us in the work that we do with Wake in the Wild. She's calling me to even more of that, and even more of opening people to spirit, again, in a way that's right for them within that community. So they are things that I wouldn't have even been aware of if I'd been looking out there for examples. She's led me to examples. She's led me to, human guides and teachers, and also many, many non-human guides and teachers. But if I'd been without her, I can't imagine any of that would have been able to unfold. In fact, I'm going to ask you, having heard my story, what do you feel if I hadn't had the wild priestess come to me in the way she had? Do you feel that everything that's taken place over the last 6 years for me would have taken place? That's my question to you. I don't feel a need to kind of convince you, but really the question, again, linking back to the point of this show, what we're talking about here, these archetypes and how they help us do our soul work. Could I have gone from coach or whatever I was calling myself then to what I do now, which is this kind of, I still don't know what to call myself, shamanic priestess, mother, lover, without the archetypes. And again, very specifically, the wild priestess, the priestess archetype, and how she led me to the queen, the mother, the shaman, and more. Do you think I could have gone on that journey without her? So now we're coming up on time. I really hope that listening to this has illuminated something for you. And it doesn't mean, like, if you don't have this clear sense of, oh, I need to know then which archetype is for me. If you don't, that's absolutely fine. It doesn't mean that you don't have one. It doesn't mean you're not magical. It may well just be, and I'd suggest the very fact you're here right now listening to this is that perhaps you just weren't ready to hear it until now. I would suggest you start to take notice, pay attention. Your archetype, like the way the wild priestess spoke to me, may come in all kinds of ways that you couldn't plan for. This is the way these things that are soul aligned for us unfold. So she may or he may appear to you in visions, in dreams. You might notice that you have a kind of like synchronicity of a particular thing occurring, particularly like notable symbols that are associated with a particular archetype. You might notice that new people or interests suddenly come into your life. It might be that this is the first show that you're listening to from me. I might be one of those people. It might be an intuitive nudge, like, oh, I'm meant to do that. I'm meant to look at this. And most of all, it will come via curiosity. There's often this sense of like a bit like imposter syndrome when it comes to magical archetypes, because they are just, again, if we've been raised in this world where we are so bereft of real magic, it can feel a bit like, oh, am I allowed to even be thinking about, am I, the priest, or am I the sage? Like, am I just kidding myself? Trust. If you've got curiosity about this, if you're feeling a sense of wanting to know more, it's likely for a good reason. I was I read something the other day in one of the autism groups I was in, and it was talking about people. There's a kind of big thing in the autism community about kind of a self-diagnosis versus kind of clinical diagnosis or medical diagnosis, and very much in the autistic community, it's like, if you have kind of done your research and you feel that you are autistic, you are. And that said, regardless, like, I've got a clinical diagnosis, but I agree with that entirely. And that this is the funny thing. It's like, particularly with autistic people, given how we typically kind of obsessively do our research, it's like, if you've got to the point where you've taken all these tests and read all the books and, consumed a billion podcasts, whatever way you personally like to research, and you've got to the point where you're like, yeah, I'm autistic, there's a very good chance you are. Same applies to the archetypes. If you have this kind of like intense sense of like, oh, I just love to know more about this. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not. I think I could be, but I have got these traits. Again, I'm not saying therefore it definitely means you are, but I would trust your curiosity is there for a reason. And even if it isn't necessarily, it might be that you've got curiosity for one of the archetypes, but it might just be the kind of door opener for the next one. This is an exact example, but just like I described, for me, the priestess has been the one that's opened the door to other archetypes that are soul aligned for me, like the shaman. And so if I had kind of dismissed the priestess, I wouldn't have then been led to the other archetypes that are meant for me. So just notice that. And I was asked a question prior in the pre-show party, which was, would you say that archetypes don't force themselves upon you, or is there a bit of both, as in a clear invitation and sometimes a big prod, and then they go quiet if you choose out? And I would say what I'm about to say actually applies to anything that's from soul, that's meant for us. It can only really happen in a sovereign way, in a way where we're consciously choosing. And I guess, again, anything that comes from spirit, that's the same too. There isn't this kind of like, you will do this, because it just wouldn't work. If we're in this kind of being forced to do something place, it just wouldn't make sense. That's just not how reality works here. So we will sometimes get a kind of increasingly clear sense of like, oh, this is what I'm meant to do. For me, in the case of shamanism, it took 6 months of increasingly big nudges before I was finally ready to say yes. But I really wouldn't say like there is this kind of like worry of like, oh God, if we ignore them, it's not like an idea. There's sometimes said, if we are a no to an idea, the idea is kind of like a spirit itself, and it will go to someone else and they will express the idea into the world. That's not the case with the archetypes. It's not the case with, certainly, like, again, our soul came here to embody these particular archetypes. They aren't going anywhere. They'll be here long after we are, and probably are still going to be there if we come back next lifetime around and we're still meant to embody them. So really, the main thing is like, be gentle with yourself. One of the most important archetypes is the child. If the child needs more time, if the child needs more safety, if the child needs more listening to, do that. That's the archetype to pay attention to. So if you're not ready, pay attention to the child. And when you are ready, like, the archetypes are incredibly, like, ultimately they're here to help us. They're here for us. So they'll be ready when you're ready. And also I've asked a couple of questions that were similar, and I probably have answered them to an extent as I've been recording the show. So one person asked, is it possible to embody multiple archetypes? I've never felt the call to one. I feel them all in me. Another asked, is it usual for someone to journey through the different archetypes or to embody a different archetypes at once throughout the course of a day, a week, or even a day? And as you've heard, I've embodied many archetypes, do embody many archetypes. The same is true for all of us. When it comes specific, so in a given day, particularly someone who's been in the conscious work of archetypes, they will likely be moving between and often embodying at one time the queen. I'm talking about this from a woman's perspective, because I'm thinking of me, like the queen, the mother, lover, all the way throughout the day. And when it comes to the magical archetypes, I would typically say we are going to be maybe like one or two primary ones. And if you've heard me talk about the shaman before, the shaman really is like almost like the first principles, like the root of the magical archetypes. It's the oldest of the magical archetypes. And aspects of the shaman have kind of almost like been have kind of like gone on their own path, and then also become more concentrated in specific aspects. So for example, the seer is an aspect of the shaman. You know, shamans do have seeing capacity, and some shamans, that's going to be a particularly strong capacity of the shaman, whereas someone whose primary archetype is the seer is going to have that to a larger degree than the average person embodying the shaman. So just recognize that. But often we will have one primary magical archetype or maybe a couple. Yes, I think that answers both questions. Okay, so again, we have seen many different magical archetypes being embodied and expressed in, you know, many of our students over the years. And I've named many of them. I'm just going to quickly run through some of them again, but I really would advise you, if you haven't already, or maybe even if you have, off the back of this, it might be perfect next step. I've spoken about some of these archetypes specifically in this video series on the magical archetypes. And I think I spoke about the shaman, the witch, the priestess, the sage. Am I missing any? I may have missed, maybe the magician. So I have done that series of magical archetypes, so like a little video on each of those, and that's at wakingthewilds.com/magical-archetypes. Magical-archetypes. Also, if you are a coach and your ears were pricking up when I was talking about specifically the ways that coaches are often called to the magical archetypes, like I'd say particularly called, I'd say coaches in the main are actually meant often to embody magical archetypes. You can find a podcast I did all about that at wakingthewilds.com/podcast/382. And I would also suggest you really notice what's coming up for you, what's in the way, what resistance are you feeling. This is the place where it is really important for us to be able to embody these archetypes. We look at the shadow that's in the way and is like there for us in that particular archetype. And so, and as I said before, we really have to consciously take the child along for that ride. It's not something we can do and ignore them and it work out well. And finally, for some of you, the next step here could be to join us in Waking the Wild Medicine. And this very much is all about what we've been talking about here. It is that work of understanding what your deepest soul work is, and then which of the magical archetypes are there to help you do that, to help you understand, like, this is who I really am, again, through the lens of the archetypes, but also journeying into those wounds and bringing up the gold, alchemizing into the gifts. So if that sounds like something you could be called to, you can find out more at wakingthewild.com/medicine. So go have a look. You can, I mean, there's lots of resources also there, but you can go book a call and then explore if indeed it is aligned for you. It's certainly not for everyone, and it's certainly not for everyone at every time, but trust yourself. You're feeling that like, oh, maybe it is. Maybe it is. I'll make sure all the links I've mentioned are listed wherever it is that you're watching or listening to this. And for now, thank you so much for joining me. I really do appreciate it. And I hope in this you heard something that was for you particularly. Again, the whole point of this work is about your unique soul. And I really hope there was something in this that spoke to yours. Sending you all my love. Mwah. Thank you.